In today's video, we're going to be going over some basic rules and tips on how to name your variables while you're programming. Now, this is one of the more difficult parts of programming, a lot of people will tell you, is trying to find names for everything that make sense and aren't too long and aren't too short, because every lead dev and senior dev's got a different opinion on what things should be. But these are some general rules which will help you create maintainable code. And that's what this is really all about, is creating that maintainable code that the next person down the line can understand and work on without having to call you. Anyway, let's take a quick look. So basically, some simple rules here for naming your variables. Uh, Try not to shorten too much. Sometimes it's okay when it's obvious, but in my opinion, best practice is to not shorten words or use acronyms when you can avoid them. That mainly applies to functions, but sometimes it can apply to variables too, because you want it to be clear to someone who might not have the same domain knowledge. So you get a new developer in your team. You don't want them constantly messaging you because your name shows up on the Git history or the Git annotate, or sorry, Git blame. My bad. You don't want them messaging you constantly saying, well, hey, what does prog mean? Well, it means program, right? Or something like that. Or authentication, but that's just general words. Let's just say you had domain specific acronyms and words. They might ask, well, what does that acronym mean? That just creates more work for you. And especially if you're gone from the company, it creates a lot more work for the next person. But let's jump right into it. So yeah, that's one of the main rules. Try not to use acronyms where possible because they're harder to understand, requires more thinking, stuff like that. Uh, the next thing is be clear about what it is. Don't use variable x, variable z, variable y, or anything like that because that's useless. It's pointless. It's a terrible practice. It doesn't tell you what it does or what it is. If the variable doesn't tell you what it is, it's not a good variable. It makes it harder to program because now you have to go search and say, well, okay, it's an integer, but why is it an integer? What does it do? What data does it hold? It becomes pointless to you and creates more work for you if you don't do that. And, I gave an example earlier that the next person on the line might have trouble. That next person down the line might be you as well in a week or even tomorrow. It could be a tomorrow, a week, a month, a year, 10 years. Write maintainable code. Name your variables well. Let's see. So basically, some cool things that I like to do with that. Always say what it is, right? So let's just say you have a Boolean in your code and you want to know that stores whether the user is authenticated or not. Pretty simple. That's a pretty common one I've seen in my work. But let's say you've got a bool. Um, for Booleans, I like to kind of show that they're a Boolean without somebody having to go find it. So I like to do is authenticated or is initialized if the program, that way you can check if the class is initialized, stuff like that. Always use is or something along that nature just to show that it's a Boolean because there's only a yes or no answer to is authenticated. Is the user authenticated? Yes or no. True or false. That's a good way to help just differentiate what things are. It just helps people understand better or not. It helps people understand better quicker. Another one, let's say, you want to store an authentication token or an authentication key or something of that nature in a string or really anything else. You could even have an authentication token class if you wanted to. Uh, Always name it what it is. So if you've got a variable that stores an authentication token, call it authentication token. Or let's say you got to store more than one. Let's say you have a web and a client auth token. Maybe you could name one, web auth token and one client auth token. That way they're differentiated, but you still know exactly what they are. Everyone who looks at it's going to know exactly what it is. They're going to say, all right, web auth token. Well, that must be the website's authentication token. or maybe you have one that's specific for certain APIs, or really any kind of data like that, right? You just want to be as specific as possible with this without overdoing it. If your variable name's reaching all the way out like 40, 50, 60, I don't know, maybe like 100 characters, right? That might be a bit much, depending on how complicated it is. But still, keep it simple or keep it understandable. Um, you know, and then another thing, like, yeah, like I was doing earlier, name it what it is. Let's say you have a certain, just say you have a max number of connection attempts that you want to allow before you deny a user or block their IP or, anything before you send them back to try again. Uh, what you'll, what you would do theoretically is you just call an integer or a float or whatever you have connection attempts. It's, it's simple, it's sweet, it's to the point, but it's extremely obvious what it is and what it does, what it holds. And using that kind of stuff really helps you understand your code better. It makes it easier for you to maintain in the future. Let's say the boss says, okay, well, we got to add another feature. You need to go add that. New feature might be using some of these variables you already have. It's important that you can understand them in the future without having to look back on your notes, without having to rely on comments, and without having to rely on extra documentation because sometimes documentation becomes outdated pretty quick. People always say comments become outdated the second you write them. Technically true, but not really, in my opinion. As long as you maintain the comments as you maintain the code. But anyway, that's a different video with a different opinion. Anyway, that's all we have for you today. Oh, sorry, forgot about one thing. So, I find this kind of helpful. When you're using a specific class, right? Let's say URL search params. I don't always shorten them like this to URL params. Sometimes I will literally just be like, URL params equals new URL params or whatever, something like that, right? If you're only instantiating one instance of it and you don't need to differentiate or anything, just do that. It's easy, it's understandable. That way, everyone who looks at it knows that, hey, variable URL params or URL search params is of type URL search params. There's no extra thinking. It's very self-explanatory, very obvious what it is. Anyway, that's all we have for you today. Thanks for watching. Please remember to like and subscribe. Write your maintainable code, please. Makes all of our lives easier. Feel free to argue in the comments. I'm happy to have a good discussion about everyone with different opinions. Maybe you've got different opinions or different thoughts on how something should be done. Tell me. I'm happy to have a discussion. Maybe I'll change my mind. Maybe you'll change yours. Or feel free to jump into our Discord channel and have that conversation too. Thanks for watching.